Okay, I am back. I have swapped out my plaster area for my clay workstation from the prior video, and now I'm ready to do a first press molding in this face mask. So if you are in my class, you would have gotten some clay in your kit. Again, this is water-based clay. And we're going to start out with about 2 pounds of clay for this first press mold. And it's not going to be enough to fill the whole mold, especially if yours came back as far as mine did. But what I'm going to do is take the shorter log, the one that I had cut off some clay from to use for sealing my mold, and I'm just going to divide that in half. And then I'm going to use that to press into the main part of my facial features, just to really get a good sense of what this looks like. And then I'll do a little bit of practice actually carving details back into that form once I've pressed it. So I'm going to grab my clay and then get started. Okay, so you always seal up your clay. Now I've got a nice chunk of clay here. So this is called a press mold because we're taking clay and we're pressing it into the mold. Now some shapes you can work really well if you make a slab out of this clay and then press the slab into it. But we have noses that protrude out, and if I tried to press a slab into here and then push it into the nose, it would just punch right through. So you usually have to fill the nose in with a little bit of clay first, and then you could go ahead and put a slab in with the rest and really smooth those two areas together. Or you could do what I'm going to do, which is to sort of work in small chunks and kind of piece things together. That will result in some weird cracks and kind of fissure looking things on my mask, and sometimes people intentionally do that when they're making castings. They put little balls of clay in there or coils of clay and get surface decoration. I'm doing it for a couple reasons. One is if I pounded this clay on the table to make a slab, it would be really loud, and a lot of you might not have space to work with your clay, and so I'm just going to show you this kind of simple method of just pressing the clay into it for that reason. But if you can make a little noise, you can use the side of your fist to hammer down the clay. We are looking to try to build these masks, and this is important, no more than 1/2 inch, but definitely not as thin as 1/4 inch. So like 3/8 inch is kind of perfect. I sometimes try to find like fingers that are different sizes, and my pinky is kind of close to about the thickness that I'm looking for. So, or you could get a ruler and actually measure. So I'm going to just start first at the nose by pushing the clay into the nose and then work my way out, kind of patchworking this together. And I'm deciding, do I want flat pieces or maybe like some coil-like shapes? So I'll just try some different things out. Cut a little disc. I'm actually going to cut that disc in half. Maybe even that sort of fits in like it's a nose shape. So this is really tempting when you get clay to go like this and to squeeze into it and really play with it and maybe even fold it in on itself. But what this has just done is mixed air into the clay, and so that air that's in the clay is essentially trapped moisture, and when it goes into the kiln, which can get up to, I guess we're bisquing, so around 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, that water will get trapped in that air bubble and create steam, and it can explode in the kiln. So I'm working with clay straight out of the bag. There is a technique called wedging but I'm not going to show you for this demo. So try to just use the clay straight out of the bag. I mean, I guess actually I will demo a little bit with this little piece, but it's essentially a rocking motion where you are spiraling the clay in on itself so that the inside clay is coming to the outside and the outside is moving to the inside. And that way you can hopefully eliminate all of those air bubbles. This is like a technique that takes a lot of practice wedging. There's more video tutorials you could find on YouTube for it. In a pinch, you could also just slam down the clay to kind of harden it like this. And I shouldn't have said to harden. I meant to get the air bubbles kind of out of the surface a little. Okay. So I've got this first piece and I'm going to press it into the nose area. And I'm actually kind of making this as I'm looking and realizing this is probably not what I want. I'm readjusting my plan. So I made it a little skinnier to kind of fit in there because I can press in a skinnier shape and then from the back push it and it'll squish its way out. So I wonder if I can hold it like this and kind of show you what I'm doing. Okay, before I do too much more, I don't want to make these edges too thin. I will be adding more clay over to them, but they can have a little taper to them. That might help a little bit with how much cleanup I have to do. But I also want to kind of remind myself that that nose was right here, like picking your nose in reverse, I guess. And I'm hollowing it out just a little bit so that it's not as thick as that chunk of clay that I initially put in there. It can kind of become a little bit difficult to know actually where that nose is when it's in the mold like this. So the other thing you could do is just press all the clay into the mold, thinking really carefully about all of these edges, but leaving the nose solid. And when you take out the casting, you could poke a needle tool through the nose and find out where it actually is and then hollow it out after you pull it out. So that might not be a bad idea if this is your first time making a casting. It's just leave it solid and work with it later. Okay, so I'm pressing everything in really well. You've got it like that. And now I'm going to start just adding more clay. I've got it about that thick. That is sort of a little fatter than my pinky. I don't know if you can see, because I'll eventually kind of be smoothing it out. And I'm overlapping it. Okay, I'm going to get another piece and go here, another one for the mouth, and then another one for the forehead. So you can slap the clay between your hands to make a little bit of a slab. I took a clay that was about this thick and thinned it down. Again, pay attention to the thickness there. I see a lot of beginning students really go too thin with their slab, and it's easier to work with a thicker slab than it is a thinner slab because you can always scrape clay away. But if you go to add clay, that's when you risk trapping moisture in between your layers of clay. So from that 2 pounds of clay that I grabbed, or the half of the shorter log, I don't have too much clay left. I'm getting a pretty decent amount of clay to fill up the mold, but it's, again, not going to go all the way to the edges. And it's important to start visualizing and thinking about how much material that you need to do the kind of work that you want to do. And start to keep track of that so that you can be more efficient as you're working with your projects. If you plan on making 50 of these masks, then you want to know how much each one takes for clay so that when you go to the clay supply store, you don't only buy one 20-pound bag when it turns out that each of these molds takes 5 pounds of clay. You'd only get 4 out of that bag. So it's important to start paying attention to things like that. Okay, so I have some extra clay, and I could decide that what I have is good enough, or I could decide that I want to be a little bit more careful with the edge. It's not perfectly uniform, and so I'm going to just build up a couple of these edges, one to thicken them, like this is really thin right here, but also to kind of help round it out a little more. There you can see that wave. Now, if you've worked with clay before, you might be wondering why I'm not scoring and slipping. And it's because I'm working with such fresh clay that it's really going to adhere to itself. And you'll also see that I do a lot of compression of the clay. And so that really connects the clay really well to itself. If any spots feel thin, then that's where you want to put that extra clay. Okay, so I think that I actually have almost as much of this filled as I want. And I'm trying to be careful around these edges to actually think about this being the bottom edge that's flat as opposed to like smoothed out and thin. We want the thickness of the mask to be uniform all the way around, and then also the edges to reflect that. So we don't want a fine little delicate edge that's going to chip and break. We want it to have width around it. Think about the rim of your coffee mug or a cereal bowl that's made out of ceramic. You see the thickness of the clay. All right, so I have all the clay in the mold, and now I'm going to really focus in on pressing it into the mold. And careful at the edges so I don't end up making them thin. It's so easy to want to do that. And I especially seem to recall that my eyes are around here somewhere and my nose is here. So I want to make sure that I'm pressing the clay really well into those areas. Again, as I said, this process of working with plaster bandages gives you a really good general shape of your own face, but it's not perfect. And so if you don't push it in perfectly the first time, it's okay, because I also told you we'll be sculpting these back. So as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing I've got an extra little bit there. It's a little thin over here. I do have some extra clay, so I can decide either to fill in more clay around some of these edges since I have the clay, or I could decide to cut some of this away. Now when I say the word cut, I mean cut very delicately. A rubber tool is always better, or plastic is better than metal, but or wood is also okay. So if I wanted to cut that lip back, I could use this to kind of cut carefully. And the reason I'm being careful is because I don't want plaster in my clay. So if I cut it, it'll compromise the mold. So I think I can make a better edge. I'm going to just try. And I got a little thin. So I pulled out my clay tool, and there's this cool, this is one of my favorite tools. It's got this little sort of rounded tip, which is kind of like a little fingertip. But I can use my whole hand to control that and just gently compact or compress the clay so that I don't have that thin edge. It's one of the great things about working with clay is it has this plastic property which allows it to kind of compress and change shapes multiple times as you are working with it. While I'm continuing to pay attention to this, let me just talk a little bit about some of the different stages of clay. As clay dries, it begins to shrink and it loses that plasticity. And so there are different stages of clay when it's best for working and doing certain things. So right now, this plastic stage of clay is when I should be pushing it in and manipulating it and really trying to get it into all the nooks and crannies, because that's really going to give me the most reflection of the shape that I'm casting. But if I go to sculpt in detail and the clay is so soft and plasticky, kind of like this, and it's a little sticky. What's good is it's not so sticky that it's stuck to my hands. That would mean that the clay had too much moisture in it. It shouldn't stick to your hands. But anyways, you want the clay to stiffen up a little bit so that you can pick up good detail from the clay. The color of the clay changes as it goes through different drying stages. So when it's in this plastic state, it's really a sort of dark, rich color depending on the clay. But then it starts lightening up in color as it starts to dry. It's also colder to the touch when it's in its plastic stages, and just a little warmer when it's dry. Okay, so that looks a little bit better to me. When I take it out of the mold, I can still do a little manipulating, but I don't want extreme ups and downs. One other thing you can do just to be like super sure that all your seams have come together, it's not always necessary, but I'll just show you, is you can take a fork. They also have these tools that are called serrated edge ribs. This is not one of them, but it would look like this with little teeth all along the edge. It's one of my favorite tools, especially the ones that are flexible. And those little teeth could help kind of smooth this out. You want to be careful not to get the metal on the plaster, but what I'm doing here is cutting into the clay, and this is sort of really assuring that everything is going to be joined together from all the little pieces that I put in there. I'm not trying to go through the clay. And then I go back either with my fingers and smooth that out or press it in. Or again, you could use the back of this wooden tool to help smooth things out. If you notice that you end up feeling the clay move in a weird way and you had added a bunch of clay in that area, it's very possible that you got an air pocket in the clay, and there would be no harm in taking your needle tool and poking the clay where you think something funny was happening, perhaps an air bubble, and then just smoothing over those little needle tool marks. That'll help seal or remove that air pocket. Another thing to do really gently, especially in these situations where you're like, I really don't know where my nose is. I kind of have no clue. I sort of guessed. You could gently take your needle tool and you could push it into the, well, let me just sort of show you it like this. Take your needle tool, you press it into clay, and you have a finger behind it, or in this case plaster, and I'm just going to gently push through the clay until I can either feel it with my fingertip or it stops because of the plaster. And then what you want to do is slide your pointer finger and your thumb right up to the tip of that needle and hold on to it where it meets the clay. And then if you pull that out, that is going to tell you that that is the thickness of your clay there. So I'm going to test some of my mold. So that's really thin. That's about 1/4 inch. As I was pushing in the clay, it started to feel a little thin. So I think I'm just going to back this area a little bit more, especially along those sides, just to be sure. So I'm glad I saved a little bit of clay. Now, because I'm adding clay to more clay and I don't want to trap air, instead of making a big flat slab, I'm making some coils and I'm laying those down along and then smoothing them out. And if I need another one next to it, I can smooth that edge out and then lay another one on top and smooth that out. So these are sort of shortcuts for getting away with not scoring and slipping, but also avoiding those air bubbles. Final little step I'm going to do is think about these edges here just a little bit more. Scratched it by using my nail, so be careful. Right, and this is all a learning process. So even though I say don't do this, you're gonna do it. It's just part of that. There's a big learning curve. And then even as I said, I myself kind of cut back into the mold, just sort of not thinking too much about it. And the nice thing about using clay in this mask in plaster is that this can be used more than one time. So I've mentioned before, like you could make 50 noses, or you could make, multiple castings. The plaster should be fairly durable for a number of castings, so long as you take good care of the mold, don't scratch it up, crack it, break it. It'll eventually lose its ability to make a good cast, but then you can just make another. I could also do one final check. I had checked for thin spots here, but I could also check for thick spots. If you are in my class, we don't have a lot of clay, and we'll be making several different mask variations. So look for the instructions on those. They're each just a little different. But this is your clay, so you're not going to want to use one log for your first mask because you might not have enough for your next masks. And so we can get rid of some of that thickness if you find that you have some thick areas, because then you have a little more clay. But it's also important that you have a uniform thickness of the clay. If you have thin spots next to really thick spots, clay shrinks as it dries. The thinner spots will dry faster and shrink, and the thicker spots will still be holding their moisture and they won't shrink at the same rate, and then you end up getting a crack in your clay. So that's another reason why paying attention to the thickness is important. Now, if I thought that I wanted to hang this completed mask up on the wall, I could start thinking about that right now, especially since I do have a little extra clay. I know that this is the top, and so I could make a slab that goes across the piece about right here in the middle, or just like a little sort of shelf here that you could put a little nail under. So I'm just gonna build something in right away. So I've got my chunk of clay, and I'm just kind of visually looking to see what I can make based off of how much clay I still have out. You don't have to do this step. There are other ways that you can hang pieces afterwards if you didn't build in a system. I'm just sort of showing you this as an extra little bit. So I think what I'm going to do is kind of this thicker slab, tapered ends, and it's going to be set into the mask rim just a little bit. I'll show you what I mean. In a second here. So I'm going to put that right there. Maybe up just a little higher. But this time, because I am using this as a strength component, I'm going to at least score the clay. I'm not going to do the slip part because this clay is fresh out of the bag and it's super sticky. But when I talk about scoring and slipping, the scoring part is essentially scratching the surface of the clay so that you kind of mess it up and make it a little bit toothy. You can do this with a fork, you can do it with a needle tool. They sell tools to do this at the clay store. And then I marked where it was going to go on here, and it's the back of the piece and no one's ever going to see it. So I'm also just going to scratch into there on both sides. And then I will add this piece, really compress it in. And then it's hard for me to really get sort of underneath here. So I'm going to use this tool to kind of merge these areas of clay into one another. I'm even going to scratch over these two. I kind of call this like the little Frankenstein where you're like stitching things together. The idea with scoring and slipping, at least with the scoring part, is that you want the clay from the one side that you're joining to the other side to interlock with one another as opposed to just butting up next to one another. Because even though it seems like it's going to stick now because the clay is really sticky, if you don't get those clay particles locked together, it's just going to, when it dries, separate. So we're going for a sort of a locking action. And if you don't have a lot of moisture in the clay, then slip, which is kind of like glue, is also really helpful. But it's just clay, your same clay, mixed with a little bit of water to make it kind of stickier. So that's when I say slip, that's what I'm referring to. If you have a piece of clay spanning a large area and it wants to sink or slump, you can put a little bit of newspaper underneath there to help hold it up. This clay seems to be doing just fine, and so I am going to just leave it. Okay, so here is my mask. Is that crooked? Oh, that's so crooked. Okay, well, I'll fix it on my own. But this is about where you need for the mask to be. And we've already been working for 35 minutes, or I have. And it's going to take a while before this mask wants to release from the plaster. And I can't say 2 hours and 24 minutes, come back here and that is when it will be ready, because it varies so greatly depending on how wet or dry the mold is, how much water or moisture your clay has in it, what the temperature of the room is that it will be sort of setting. And so you will want to come and babysit this and check on it like maybe in 30 minutes. And what we're looking for is we're trying to see if we can get the sides to release from the mold a little bit. And if it doesn't want to come free, then it's still a little too sticky and a little too wet. But we don't want the clay to dry in the mold, because then it's gone beyond the plastic and the leather hard state where I can carve in detail to what is called the bone dry state. And at that point the clay is too dry and you can't sculpt back into it. One, you can't sculpt back into it just because it won't work. And two, clay dust is really bad for breathing. So you do not want to work with clay when it is dry and not fired because of the dust. So I'm going to fix this, and then I'm going to come back and continue to check on this in 30 minutes and maybe another 30 minutes. And eventually I should be able to get this mask to come out. But I also might find that I've got some undercuts. Maybe my nostrils are kind of holding or catching some things. I'm probably going to have to use a piece of clay to help release this just because it's shallower than the mold. So I'll show you all that in a bit.